Clara Mitchell was a woman whose life could easily be mistaken for a hymn, quiet, steady, and carried by the rhythm of devotion. Every morning in Willow Creek began the same way for her. She would open the window to let in the breeze, her hands resting on the sill as though she were greeting the day personally. The smell of dew clung to the grass, and the soft cooing of doves perched on the oak tree by the fence always gave her comfort. Her little garden, with its neat rows of daisies and the proud red roses that she had coaxed from stubborn soil, seemed to smile back at her each morning. She would pull her apron around her waist, pat down the flour on the kitchen table, and set her bread to rise as though it were a small offering to heaven itself. There was nothing hurried in Clara's world, for she believed that a house is not simply a place to live, but a temple where peace must dwell. Her husband David would often return from work to find a home that carried the aroma of roast chicken or apple pie, a table set with fresh linen, and a woman waiting who wore a smile that seemed lit by the warmth of her faith. To Clara, love was not loud, it was not boastful. It was in the folding of clothes, in the sweeping of the floor, in the prayer whispered while stirring a pot. Her life felt sewn together by the threads of service and simplicity. Yet, behind the gentleness of her days, there was a stillness in David's eyes she could not ignore. He had begun to laugh less, to spend more time staring into the distance when he thought no one was watching. Clara noticed, but said little. She remembered the scripture, "A wise woman builds her house, but the foolish tears it down with her hands." Proverbs 14, verse 1. So she built with patience, choosing not to confront shadows she could not yet name, hoping that her quiet care would anchor David, as it always had. But sometimes even the strongest anchors cannot hold when the tide begins to rise. The town of Willow Creek was small, no larger than a cluster of stories held together by winding roads and wooden porches. It was the kind of place where every house bore its history in the cracks of the paint, and where a neighbor's sigh was often felt across the fence before it was ever spoken aloud. Clara knew almost everyone there, from Mrs. Dobbins, who sold pies at the corner store, to old Mr. Harper, who leaned on his cane and told tales that grew taller with every season. It was in this town, amidst its watchful eyes and whispering streets, that Clara built her reputation as a woman who carried her home like a crown. People admired her diligence, her patience, her quiet grace, and they said she was the kind of wife many men prayed for but few found. Yet while others saw perfection, Clara herself only saw duty. She felt it was her calling to ensure that David had a refuge from the world's storms, a place where his burdens dissolved at the threshold. And though she wore her devotion like armor, she often found herself lying awake in the dark, wondering if the man beside her was drifting into waters she could not reach. He had grown restless, coming home later, his words clipped short like ropes that once held firm, but now snapped with ease. Clara held her silence like a candle in the wind, fragile but unextinguished. She remembered her mother's saying, "A woman's prayer can go where her feet cannot." So when the nights grew heavy with unspoken worries, she folded her hands and whispered scriptures into the darkness, trusting that God was listening, even if David was not. Clara's faith was not merely a matter of Sunday services or hymnals sung from the back pew of Willow Creek Chapel. It was the marrow of her bones, the language she spoke without words. Every corner of her house bore witness to it, the cross stitched into the curtain by her own hands, the Bible worn soft from years of turning pages, the wooden chair in the corner where she often knelt in prayer until her knees ached. To her, prayer was not a ritual but a lifeline, stretched between heaven and earth, unbreakable even in silence. When David began pulling away, she did not accuse or scold, for she believed that confrontation might bruise where prayer could heal. Instead, she would rise before dawn, when even the rooster had not yet announced the day, and whisper into the stillness, "Lord, keep this house under your wings, and do not let it fall." Her prayers were not long speeches, but they were laced with tears and hope, words poured from a heart that refused to surrender. She believed firmly in the verse, "The effectual fervent prayer of a righteous man availeth much." James 5, verse 16. And so she prayed, as though her whispers could tilt the heavens in her favor. Yet in her quiet moments when the bread cooled on the rack and the house was still, Clara sometimes felt the weight of solitude pressing down. Love, she realized, can be like a field, beautiful when sown, but vulnerable if left untended. She longed for David's laughter, the deep, hearty sound that once filled their evenings, but it had become rare, like rain in drought. She held on, believing that just as fields recover when the rains return, so too would her marriage when God's time arrived. What Clara did not know was that the clouds gathering over her home carried not the rain of blessing, but the storm of trial. That storm made itself known not with thunder, but with silence. It was in the way David lingered by the window longer than usual, staring at nothing, as though his thoughts had packed their bags and gone wandering. It was in the way he no longer asked about the garden, the meals, or even the neighbors whose gossip once amused him. Clara saw the change and felt it in her bones, the way a farmer knows the weather is shifting before the first drop of rain falls. Yet she chose patience, as she always did. She believed in seasons, spring, summer, fall, winter, and she trusted that this too was a season, perhaps a passing cloud. Still, the unease gnawed at her, for every day that passed, she felt herself slipping further from his world. She told herself that love is not always laughter and roses. Sometimes it is endurance and prayer. And so she endured and she prayed. Each night before closing her eyes, she repeated Psalm 127, verse 1. Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it. It was her anchor, her shield against despair. But beneath the steady rhythm of her prayers, an unspoken fear began to whisper. What if this house, this marriage, this life she had built with such care, was already slipping beyond what her hands could hold? And in that fear, she clung to God all the more, for she knew that when a woman's hands fail, her prayers rise higher than the rafters and reach the throne of heaven itself. The morning that altered Clara's life began like any other, though she would later recall that the sky carried an odd stillness, as though the clouds themselves held their breath. She had just pulled a loaf of bread from the oven, the golden crust steaming, filling the kitchen with warmth. The hum of her day was gentle, predictable, and she found comfort in the way each task followed another like beads on a rosary. She dusted the flour from her hands, wiped her brow, and prepared to sweep the front porch when a shadow crossed her doorstep. Clara opened the door expecting to see Mrs. Dobbins dropping off a basket of eggs, or perhaps the postman delivering letters, but instead, a stranger stood before her. The woman was tall, her posture straight as though she carried herself with rehearsed pride, and her smile, sharp yet polished, spread across her face as though she had been waiting for this very moment. Beside her feet sat two heavy suitcases, scuffed but dignified, the kind of luggage that spoke not of hurried escapes but of deliberate arrivals. The stranger's eyes scanned the house, flickering across the doorway, the windows, the curtains, in the same way a hawk circles over a field before deciding where to land. Clara's throat tightened, and though she had never seen this woman before, something in her spirit whispered that this was not a traveler in need, nor a passerby seeking directions. "Good morning," the stranger said, her tone firm yet sweet, like honey poured over steel. "My name is Vanessa Turner, and I believe David is expecting me." The words struck Clara like a stone to glass. For a heartbeat, she could not find her tongue, could not shape a reply. She glanced at the luggage again, then back to the woman's piercing eyes, and a cold shiver traveled down her spine. The loaf of bread still steamed in the kitchen, the broom leaned against the wall, and the gentle rhythm of her life shattered in the space of a single sentence. Clara gripped the doorframe to steady herself, and inwardly she remembered Psalm 27, verse 1. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? The Lord is the strength of my life. Of whom shall I be afraid?" Yet even as she recited it silently, fear curled its fingers around her heart, for she understood instinctively that her doorstep had just become a battlefield. Moments later, the sound of David's boots on the walkway reached Clara's ears, each step echoing louder than the last. She turned, hoping to see confusion or surprise on his face, something that might affirm her disbelief. Instead, what she saw drained the color from her cheeks. David was calm, too calm, as though he had rehearsed this moment in his mind many times before. His lips pressed into a thin line before curving into a faint smile directed at Vanessa, not at Clara. "Vanessa," he said, his voice steady, almost warm. "You made it." Those words cracked the fragile shell of hope Clara had clung to, and in their place came a tide of bewilderment. She felt her knees weaken, as though the ground itself had shifted beneath her feet. Vanessa, without hesitation, lifted her suitcase handles, ready to step across the threshold as though it had always belonged to her. Clara's voice finally returned, thin and trembling. "David, who is this? What is going on?" But her husband did not meet her gaze. Instead, he placed his hand lightly on Vanessa's shoulder, a gesture that spoke more than words, and replied, "She's a friend, Clara. She'll be staying with us for a while." The phrase pierced Clara deeper than a blade, for in it she heard not just betrayal but dismissal, as if her own feelings were mere dust in the wind. She could scarcely believe her ears. This was her home, her sanctuary, the place she had tended with prayer and love, and yet here stood a stranger with luggage in hand, claiming a place at its hearth. Clara's mind swirled with questions that had no answers. She wanted to shout, to demand explanation, but her lips quivered with silence instead. Vanessa's eyes met hers, not with kindness, but with a glint of possession, as if she had already mapped the rooms in her mind, chosen her seat at the table, and pictured her hands arranging the flowers Clara had planted. The weight of that gaze pressed down heavily, and Clara realized that the fight before her was not just with flesh and blood, but with something deeper. She remembered Ephesians 6 verse 12. "For we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against powers, against the rulers of the darkness of this world." Yet even that reminder did not soften the blow of seeing her husband, her partner, opening the door wider for another woman, while she herself stood trembling on the threshold. From that day onward, Vanessa's presence in the house was like ink spilled across white linen, spreading silently at first, then staining everything it touched. She walked through the hallways with the air of someone who had earned her place, her heels clicking against the wooden floors as though marking territory. At mealtimes, she offered to cook, her hands confident with spices Clara had never used, and David praised her flavors with a laughter that had been absent for months. Clara watched in silence, her fork heavy in her hand, each bite of food turning bitter in her mouth. Vanessa's words carried confidence, often layered with charm, yet underneath them Clara sensed sharpness, like thorns hidden beneath petals. When visitors came by, Vanessa greeted them before Clara could, her voice rising above the conversations, till neighbors began nodding to her as if she were the rightful hostess. Clara, once the pillar of her household, felt herself shrinking into the background, like wallpaper fading with time. Her bed no longer felt like her own, for even in the silence of the night, she could sense Vanessa's shadow seeping into every corner. And yet, instead of lashing out, Clara chose to retreat into prayer, her tears falling on the pages of her Bible as she whispered, "Be still and know that I am God," Psalm 46 verse 10. She prayed with a desperation that only the wounded understand, asking God to preserve her heart when everything else seemed to crumble. But even as she prayed, she felt her strength waning. David, once her confidant, now seemed like a stranger in his own home, his words always leaning in Vanessa's direction, his laughter echoing for her ears alone. Clara felt like a ghost drifting through the house she had built, unseen, unheard, and unwelcomed. Her prayers were her only company, her only refuge, though even they sometimes felt like seeds scattered on hard ground. Still, Clara was not without awareness. She knew that storms rarely arrive with lightning first. Often, they begin with whispers in the wind. Vanessa's mannerisms, though wrapped in courtesy, bore signs of conquest. She moved furniture slightly, shifted ornaments as though testing how the house would look under her touch. And when she sat on the living room sofa, she leaned back as if claiming ownership. Clara saw it all, every gesture, every glance, and her heart burned with a mixture of sorrow and indignation. She wanted to shout, to tell Vanessa that no matter how boldly she smiled or how swiftly she spoke, this house was not hers. Yet each time she opened her mouth, David's eyes silenced her, eyes that no longer held tenderness but a weary patience. As though her protests were nuisances he no longer wished to endure. It was then that Clara realized her battle was not one she could win with words. She had only one weapon left, the same one that had carried her through every season of doubt: prayer. She returned to her little wooden chair in the corner, her knees pressing into the rug, her hands trembling as she lifted her voice to God. "Lord," she whispered, "I do not understand this, but you see all. Give me strength not to hate, wisdom not to despair, and courage to endure." She clung to Romans 12, verse 12. "Rejoice in hope, be patient in tribulation, be constant in prayer." And though her tears blurred the words on the page, her spirit clung fiercely to them. Yet even with prayer, Clara felt the ground shifting beneath her. Vanessa was no longer a guest. She was a force, a presence, a tide rising against the walls of Clara's life. And tides once risen do not easily retreat. Vanessa's influence began like the faint hum of a bee in a quiet room, barely noticeable at first, but soon impossible to ignore. She had entered the Mitchell household as a so-called guest, yet every day she lingered longer at the heart of the home until it felt as if the walls bent toward her instead of Clara. She spoke with confidence, her voice rising at the dinner table as though she were conducting an orchestra, while Clara's words shrank into whispers that no one cared to hear. At first, Vanessa made small changes that seemed harmless. She shifted the salt and pepper shakers, exchanged Clara's handmade tablecloth for a brighter fabric she claimed brought energy into the room, and even placed her perfumes on the dresser in the guest room. But soon she drifted from small tokens to larger moves, her laughter filling the kitchen, her footsteps echoing down the hallway, her opinions reshaping daily routines. Clara would walk into the living room and find Vanessa seated comfortably, legs crossed, her hands gesturing as she spoke to David about matters Clara had never been consulted on, decisions about their finances, their social visits, even how the garden might be reorganized. It was as though the stranger had written herself into their story and refused to be erased. David, blinded by Vanessa's charm, rarely noticed Clara's quiet dismay. He seemed intoxicated by Vanessa's presence, hanging on to her words like a thirsty man at a well. The warmth Clara once offered him was treated like stale bread, but every suggestion from Vanessa was received as if it were honey from the comb. Clara felt herself unraveling, as though she were a thread in her own tapestry being pulled loose stitch by stitch. In her anguish, she remembered Ecclesiastes 3 verse 6, "A time to keep and a time to cast away." She wondered whether her husband was casting her away without even realizing it. Yet in that wondering, she kept returning to her knees, praying that the God who parted seas could also part the storm that was overtaking her house. The shifts were subtle but deliberate, each one like a chess piece being moved on a board where Clara had no say. Vanessa began cooking more often, and while Clara appreciated the break from her usual duties, she noticed that David praised every meal as though it were a feast from heaven itself. Clara had cooked for him for years, meals seasoned with care, bread baked with prayer, soup stirred with patience, and never had she heard the kind of laughter that now spilled from him at Vanessa's stews and sauces. The injustice of it gnawed at her spirit, yet she bit her tongue, for she knew that bitterness is a poison that corrodes the vessel that carries it. Instead, she lifted her concerns to God, whispering into the darkness when all others slept. Still, the enemy's grip on her home tightened. Vanessa moved from cooking to rearranging furniture, claiming the sofa looked better angled toward the window and the chairs belonged nearer the fireplace. David nodded along, his approval ringing like a judge's gavel sealing Clara's silence. Clara often stood watching, her hands folded against her apron, as Vanessa placed vases where her family Bible once sat or replaced the curtains she had stitched by hand with fabrics brought from town. It was not just her house Vanessa was altering, it was her identity, her history, her years of devotion. And yet David seemed blind, praising Vanessa's taste, thanking her for brightening the place. Clara's heart broke each time, for she knew the light had dimmed, not grown. "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder." Mark 10 verse 9, she reminded herself, clutching those words like a lifeline. But watching Vanessa settle deeper into her home, Clara wondered how one woman's laughter could build walls around her and silence the vows spoken on an altar years ago. Her prayers became her daily bread, and though her faith wavered, she pressed on, for she believed that even broken voices rise to heaven. What stung Clara most was not just the rearrangements of her house, but the subtle theft of her place beside her husband. Vanessa had a way of speaking for David, answering questions directed at him, finishing his sentences as though she had lived his life longer than Clara ever had. Neighbors who visited began looking to Vanessa instead of Clara for instructions, and slowly, the respect Clara had cultivated for years shifted to this newcomer. At the dinner table, Clara found her usual seat taken more often, Vanessa leaning into conversations with David as if no one else existed. The intimacy Clara once knew was slowly strangled, replaced by an invisible wall built from Vanessa's words and David's complacency. Clara often excused herself early, retreating to her prayer corner, tears staining the cushion where her knees dug deep into the rug. Her cries to God grew louder in her solitude. "Lord, I am drowning in silence." "Do you see me?" she asked, gripping the Bible that felt heavier with every passing day. She opened to Isaiah 41, verse 10. "Fear thou not, for I am with thee. Be not dismayed, for I am thy God. I will strengthen thee. Yea, I will help thee." The verse comforted her, but the ache in her chest lingered like a bruise that would not heal. Each morning she rose, determined to face another day, only to find her authority eroded further. Even the servants began taking orders from Vanessa, glancing at Clara with pity, as though her voice had lost its command. The idiom "possession is 9/10 of the law" echoed in Clara's mind, for Vanessa's actions declared ownership even without legal right. Clara knew she was still David's wife, yet she felt more like a tenant in her own home, her presence tolerated rather than cherished. Still, she clung to prayer as a drowning woman clings to driftwood, for without it she feared she would be swallowed whole by despair. Though the days pressed heavily upon her, Clara refused to surrender completely. There were moments when Vanessa's shadow loomed so large that Clara felt invisible, but even in those hours, she reminded herself that her true strength came not from human approval, but from the God who sees all. One evening, after enduring another day of Vanessa's dominance, Clara slipped into the quiet of the backyard, where the stars spread themselves like diamonds across a black velvet sky. She lifted her eyes and whispered, "Lord, if this cup cannot pass from me, give me strength to drink it." It was a prayer of surrender, not defeat, for Clara believed that God's timing was greater than her suffering. Yet even as she prayed, her heart ached for the man she had loved, the partner she had nurtured, who now seemed spellbound by another's presence. She thought of Job, stripped of so much yet steadfast in faith, and found comfort in Job 19, verse 25. "For I know that my Redeemer liveth, and that he shall stand at the latter day upon the earth." These words became her anthem in the dark, carrying her when her own strength faltered. Meanwhile, inside the house, Vanessa continued her quiet conquest, her laughter echoing through walls that once knew only Clara's hymns. To the neighbors, the house seemed more vibrant, more alive. But Clara knew the truth. It was not life that filled those rooms, but noise that drowned the spirit. She walked back inside, her shoulders squared, her eyes moist but steady. She had not won any battle that day, nor reclaimed her rightful place, but she carried a seed of hope within her soul. For Clara understood one truth that Vanessa could never steal. A woman who prays is never truly alone, and the God she called upon was greater than the tide rising against her. The evening that sealed Clara's fate began with a silence so thick it felt as though the very air refused to move. The lamps glowed faintly, casting shadows that stretched like fingers across the walls. David sat at the edge of the dining table, his hands folded, his face grave in a way Clara had not seen before. She had spent the day preparing his favorite stew, kneading bread, and sweeping every corner as if tidiness could repair what was breaking. But when he finally spoke, his words struck like an axe splitting wood. "Clara, things are not working out." The phrase was delivered without anger, without passion, but with the cold finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. Clara's spoon clattered against the bowl, her chest tightening as though the breath had been pressed out of her. For a moment she thought she had misheard him, that perhaps his weariness had tangled his meaning. "What do you mean, David?" she whispered, her voice barely carrying across the table. He sighed, his eyes still refusing to meet hers, and replied, I think it would be best if you left for a while. You need some space. We need some space." The words were simple, but they shattered like glass inside Clara's heart. Her gaze drifted toward Vanessa, who lingered in the doorway like a shadow come to life. Her lips curled faintly at the edges, not in joy, not in pity, but in a satisfaction so subtle it chilled Clara's soul. The house she had built, the vows she had honored, the love she had poured out like water into parched ground, all of it was being dismissed with a sentence. Clara's hands trembled as she placed her napkin down. Her throat ached, but she whispered a prayer in silence. "When my father and my mother forsake me, then the Lord will take me up." Psalm 27, verse 10. That verse became her anchor in the storm, though her heart bled from the wound of rejection. She rose slowly from her seat, each step feeling heavier than the last, as though the floor itself resisted her departure. Upstairs, she reached for her suitcase, the same one she had used only for trips to visit her parents in years past, and began to fold her clothes with trembling hands. Each garment carried memories, the apron that had caught flour and laughter in the kitchen. The shawl David once said made her look like a queen, the Sunday dress she wore when they held hands in church. As she laid them into the suitcase, tears fell on the fabric, staining them with grief. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her heart pounding like a drum of war inside her chest. She felt as though she were packing not clothes, but fragments of herself, every piece of fabric carrying the echo of a life she had poured into this house. From the hallway came the faint creak of the floorboards, and when she glanced up, Vanessa stood watching her with folded arms, her eyes gleaming with quiet triumph. No words passed between them, but the silence screamed louder than any insult. Clara wanted to shout, to cry out that this was her home, that no intruder had the right to strip her of it. Yet her lips quivered and no sound emerged. She remembered Christ's words in Matthew 5, verse 44. "But I say unto you, love your enemies, bless them that curse you, do good to them that hate you." It was a scripture easier read than lived, but as she closed the suitcase, she resolved that bitterness would not be her chain. Though wounded, she whispered a prayer for her own heart. "Lord, help me to endure without hatred. Guard me from the poison of revenge." With that, she lifted the suitcase, its weight heavier than stone, and carried it down the staircase where David waited with his face turned away. The night air was cool when Clara stepped outside, carrying only the bag and her fractured spirit. The house glowed behind her, its windows lit, its walls echoing faintly with the voices of David and Vanessa. It no longer felt like her refuge, but like a place where she had become a stranger, ousted and unwanted. She walked down the lane toward Emily's home, her shoes crunching against the gravel, every step echoing like a drumbeat of sorrow. Emily had been her childhood friend, the kind who shared secrets under quilts and sang hymns at twilight when they were young. It was to Emily's door that Clara now turned, her heart heavy but her soul desperate for refuge. When Emily opened the door, the sight of Clara's tear-streaked face required no explanation. Without hesitation, Emily embraced her, her arms wrapping around her like a cloak against the cold night. Clara wept against her shoulder, her sobs muffled by years of pain breaking free all at once. Emily guided her inside, sat her by the fire, and placed a warm blanket across her shoulders. The flames flickered and crackled, casting light across Clara's weary face. For the first time that day, she allowed herself to breathe fully. Though her world had collapsed, she felt a small measure of safety in her friend's embrace. Emily, wise and soft-spoken, simply whispered, "God sees you, Clara. He always has." Those words fell into Clara's heart like seeds of hope on barren soil. She clung to them, believing that even though her home had been stolen, heaven had not turned its face from her. She whispered Psalm 34, verse 18. "The Lord is nigh unto them that are of a broken heart, and saveth such as be of a contrite spirit." Her tears flowed again, but this time they carried with them the faint glimmer of trust that God had not abandoned her. As the night deepened, Clara stood by Emily's window and gazed out toward the distant silhouette of her former home. From across the town, she could see the faint glow of its lamps, the outline of the porch where she once rocked in the evenings, the windows behind which her laughter had once rung. Now, another woman walked those halls, slept in her bed, and wore her crown as though it had always been hers. Clara pressed her forehead to the cool glass, her breath fogging the pain, and felt the ache of displacement like a stone in her chest. Yet, amid the sorrow, a strange calm began to settle over her. She realized that while Vanessa could occupy her house, she could never steal her prayers, never claim her faith, never touch the covenant she held with God. That thought steadied her trembling heart. She whispered softly into the night, "Lord, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me." The verse carried her spirit upward, higher than the pain of betrayal, higher than the loneliness of her exile. She knew she was standing on a threshold, not of a house, but of a journey where her faith would either falter or flourish. Turning from the window, she knelt once more, her knees pressing into the wooden floor, her hands lifted with renewed resolve. She prayed not for David's swift return or Vanessa's downfall, but for her own endurance and wisdom. She asked for light in her darkness, strength in her weakness, and peace that surpassed understanding. And as the flames of Emily's hearth crackled behind her, Clara felt a quiet assurance rise within. Though she had been pushed out of her home, she had not been pushed out of God's hands. Vanessa's reign over the Mitchell home began to flourish like ivy creeping over stone, subtle at first, then wrapping itself around every crevice until the original foundation was almost unrecognizable. She moved through the house as though she had been born within its walls, her laughter rising at all hours, echoing through the rooms where Clara's hymns once lingered like gentle perfume. She hosted gatherings, inviting neighbors and acquaintances, presenting herself as mistress of the home with a confidence so brazen it startled even those accustomed to town gossip. Candles were lit on evenings when Clara would have preferred quiet prayer. Music was played louder than the house had ever known, and Vanessa stood at the center, her dress shimmering under lamplight, her hand often resting lightly on David's arm as though it were a crown she had won. The neighbors, who once looked upon Clara with admiration for her quiet dignity, now whispered behind fans and over fences, their tongues wagging like bells in the wind. "Have you heard how quickly he replaced her?" some murmured. "And how bold that woman is, walking through town as if she's always belonged." Their words reached Clara eventually, carried to her ears as surely as smoke betrays the presence of fire. Each whisper stung, but she endured it with grace, holding her silence like a shield. She reminded herself of Psalm 37, verse 7. "Rest in the Lord, and wait patiently for him. Fret not thyself because of him who prospereth in his way." Vanessa may have strutted as though the world bowed to her, but Clara trusted that no throne established by deceit would stand forever. Still, the wound of betrayal ached deep within her, for it is no small thing to watch another woman wear the life you once nurtured with prayer and patience. Clara's days with Emily were quiet but heavy, filled with the weight of reflection and the slow weaving of strength she never knew she possessed. Each morning she rose early to sit by the window, her Bible open on her lap, reading passages aloud as if the walls themselves needed to hear. Emily often joined her, sometimes in prayer, sometimes in silence, offering companionship that felt like balm to Clara's weary soul. They shared simple meals, walked the lanes of Willow Creek, and in the hush of evening they sang hymns softly by the fire. Though sorrow shadowed her heart, Clara began to discover fragments of herself that had long been buried beneath her duties as a wife. She remembered her love for sketching, the way she once found joy in drawing the rolling hills of Willow Creek, and Emily encouraged her to take up charcoal and paper again. At first her hand trembled, uncertain, but soon the lines flowed, and Clara felt something stir within, an identity not defined by her husband's approval or her household's order, but by the gifts God had placed within her. She found new strength in Isaiah 40, verse 31. "But they that wait upon the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings as eagles. They shall run and not be weary, and they shall walk, not faint." Clara clung to that promise, believing that her tears would one day water seeds of resilience. And though she still wept at night, clutching her pillow as memories of her home flooded back, she no longer felt crushed beyond repair. Like a tree bent by the storm but not uprooted, she stood, fragile yet rooted, awaiting the season when God would cause her to bloom again. Back in the Mitchell household, Vanessa's charm began to morph into something heavier, like wine that had turned sour after too much indulgence. What had once seemed to David like refreshing freedom now became suffocating control. Vanessa demanded more attention, more praise, more say in matters that once required thought and balance. She scrutinized the finances with sharp eyes, criticized decisions with cutting remarks. And though her laughter still filled the rooms, it no longer rang sweet to David's ears. What had been alluring confidence now burned like fire that refused to be contained. He found himself longing for the gentle presence he had once dismissed, the quiet way Clara listened, the peace she brought into every corner of their home. Yet pride kept him from admitting it, for pride is a chain heavier than iron, binding men even as it drags them down. Neighbors, too, began to notice that while Vanessa sparkled in public, her words to David in private often carried the sting of scorn. "It doesn't take long," one old farmer muttered in town, "for smoke to choke the very man who praised the fire." David smiled outwardly, but inwardly he felt caged, his choices now ruled by the woman he had welcomed so boldly. He began to feel the truth of Proverbs 21 verse 9. "It is better to dwell in a corner of the housetop than with a brawling woman in a wide house." Yet the chains of his decision weighed on him, and though he longed for peace, he knew not how to reach it. Meanwhile, Clara's prayers grew bolder, no longer whispered through tears, but spoken with authority, as though she had finally understood the power of her voice in heaven's courts. She prayed not only for her own heart, but also for David, for Vanessa, and even for the town whose whispers often wounded her. Kneeling beside Emily's hearth one evening, she lifted her hands and declared, "Lord, Lord, you see what men cannot. You judge rightly, and you alone restore. Let your will be done, and let no deceit stand forever." The words carried from her lips with a strength that surprised even her, and Emily, listening nearby, felt her own spirit lifted by the fervor of Clara's faith. From that night forward, Clara carried herself with quiet dignity, her shoulders squared, her steps steady, her eyes bright with a peace that could not be stolen. Though she remained displaced, she walked through Willow Creek with her head high, greeting neighbors with kindness, showing by her presence that a woman upheld by God cannot be undone by betrayal. People began to notice, not the scandal that had once defined her, but the strength that radiated from her wounds. They whispered less of her downfall and more of her resilience, marveling at how she had not crumbled but stood firmer than ever. Clara knew the truth. It was not her strength but God's, for she had learned that prayer is not the escape from battle but the armor within it. And though Vanessa still sat at her table and slept in her bed, Clara felt no longer defeated. She trusted that the God who shut the mouths of lions could also silence deceit and bring justice in his own time. Vanessa's triumph soon began to show cracks, though she tried to plaster them over with louder laughter and sharper commands. At first, she had worn her confidence like a jewel, dazzling and impossible to ignore, but over time that shine grew harsh, cutting even the man who once admired it. David, who had thought her boldness a refreshing wind, began to feel it whip against him like a storm he could not calm. Nights that should have been filled with peace were instead filled with disputes. Vanessa raising her voice over the smallest matters, her words striking him like stones. The meals she cooked no longer tasted like feasts, for his appetite soured beneath her scolding tongue. The very presence that once drew him now weighed heavily, and the home he thought he had won felt like a cage built of his own choices. When he walked through town, whispers trailed behind him, not of admiration, but of pity, for it was no secret that Vanessa had a sharp tongue and a heavier hand in the household. Some neighbors even muttered proverbs under their breath. "The bed of roses has thorns," they said, and David felt each thorn pressing deeper with every passing day. He remembered the serenity that once filled his house when Clara's voice sang hymns softly in the kitchen, when her prayers guarded the nights like watchmen at the gate. He realized too late that the peace he had dismissed was a treasure greater than the pride he had chased. Yet his pride was still a shackle, binding him from confessing his regret. Inside, bitterness brewed, and though Vanessa's shadow grew longer in his home, his heart grew restless, searching for a light he had willingly extinguished. Clara, though still living under Emily's roof, had transformed into a woman of quiet power, her strength forged not in comfort, but in the furnace of trial. She walked through Willow Creek with her head lifted high, no longer shrinking under the weight of whispers. Her composure startled those who expected her to crumble, for she bore herself with the dignity of one who knew her worth was anchored in heaven, not in man's approval. She tended Emily's garden, taught children in the chapel on Sundays, and offered prayers for the sick and weary, her presence becoming a balm to others, even as she healed herself. Clara had discovered that prayer was not only survival, but a weapon, carving paths where none seemed open. She prayed boldly for David, though he had betrayed her. She prayed for Vanessa, though her cruelty had driven her out. She prayed for Willow Creek, that truth and mercy would not vanish from its streets. Each prayer strengthened her, like muscles building under constant strain, and soon she no longer felt like a victim, but like a vessel, carrying something greater than sorrow. She often whispered Psalm 126, verse 5, "They that sow in tears shall reap in joy." Clara believed her tears had watered a harvest yet unseen. And though she missed her home, her hearth, her familiar routines, she knew that even in exile she had not been abandoned. Her heart was bruised, but her spirit stood taller than it ever had. The same townsfolk who once gossiped about her downfall now spoke of her resilience, comparing her to an oak tree that bends in the storm yet refuses to snap. She did not boast in this, but quietly thanked God, knowing that without his hand she would have been crushed. Inside the Mitchell home, the storm between Vanessa and David only worsened. Vanessa demanded authority over every detail, correcting his words before they left his mouth, questioning his decisions, and treating the house less like a home and more like a kingdom where only her voice mattered. David began to withdraw into silence, his laughter scarce, his steps heavy, his nights restless. Vanessa, noticing his retreat, grew harsher, as though volume could replace affection. Their once public displays of closeness became rare, replaced by strained smiles and forced gestures that fooled no one. The house, though full of light, felt dark to David, for joy cannot live where peace has fled. He began walking the long roads alone in the evenings, his mind drifting back to the gentle figure of Clara, her patience, her kindness, the way she prayed for him when no one else knew his burdens. He realized that he had traded gold for glitter, peace for noise, faithfulness for pride. But he also knew that his decisions had consequences, and the bridge he had burned might never be rebuilt. Proverbs 14 verse 1 returned to him like a haunting echo. Every wise woman buildeth her house, but the foolish plucketh it down with her hands. He saw now that Clara had built patiently, while Vanessa, despite her grandeur, was tearing everything down. The truth pierced him, but it came too late, for the damage had already been sown in the soil of betrayal. One evening, as Clara walked home from the chapel with Emily, she passed by the house that once bore her name. Through the window, she saw flickering lamplight and heard the muffled sound of raised voices. David's tone was strained, Vanessa's sharper still, the clash of their quarrel escaping into the quiet night. Clara paused, her heart tightening, not in triumph, but in sorrow. She could have turned away quickly, but instead she stood for a moment, whispering softly, "Lord, have mercy on them both." She did not wish ill upon them, though they had wronged her, for her prayers had refined her heart until bitterness no longer found a resting place. She walked on, her steps steady, her head held high, the night air cool against her cheeks. Inside the quarrel continued, but outside Clara felt peace bloom within her chest like a hidden garden. She understood then that true strength was not in reclaiming the house, nor in seeing Vanessa fall, but in knowing that no one could take from her the presence of God. As she reached Emily's porch, she looked up at the starlit sky and whispered, "The Lord is my portion, saith my soul. Therefore will I hope in him." Lamentations 3, verse 24. And with that, she stepped inside, leaving behind the voices of strife, carrying with her the calm assurance that though men had cast her aside, heaven had never turned its face from her. My dear friends, you've just heard the story of Clara, David, and Vanessa. And if there is one lesson that should echo in our hearts, it is this: peace built on prayer cannot be stolen, even when life turns against you. People may walk away, others may betray us, storms may shake the very walls of our homes, but when we anchor ourselves in God, we will not collapse. You see, beauty fades, pride falls, but a heart that trusts in the Lord stands like a tree planted by rivers of water. Clara lost what she had built with her hands, but she never lost what she had built in her spirit. And that is the message I want you to take home. Hold tightly to God, no matter who tries to take your joy. Do not let bitterness take root in your soul. Instead, let prayer be your answer, let forgiveness be your strength, and let hope be your companion. Because one thing is certain, God is not blind to your tears, and He is never deaf to your cries. Now let us pray together, and wherever you are, whether you're listening in your living room, on your porch, or before you sleep, lift your heart to heaven with me. Heavenly Father, we thank you because you are the God who sees, the God who hears, and the God who never abandons. Lord, just as you carried Clara through her valley, carry everyone listening to this story through their storms. For those who have been betrayed, let your healing flow. For those who feel displaced, give them a new song. For those who cry in silence, wipe their tears tonight. Father, restore broken hearts, restore broken homes, and restore broken peace. Let every Vanessa that rises to scatter what you have built be silenced, and let every Clara find strength in your presence. Lord, we declare your word over every listener right now. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy comes in the morning. May their morning come speedily, in Jesus' name. May their laughter return. May their dignity return. May their hope return. If you believe this prayer, shout it in your heart and type it with your fingers. Amen. Because when you say amen, you are sealing it, you are agreeing with heaven, and you are declaring that your own joy will surely come. This brings us to the end of this story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and may God bless you for doing so. Bye.